Hey, Peter. You were on the coffee run, so we didn't want to start without you.
Well, I had to have lessons from a couple of people.
Oh, well, good morning, everybody. Again, the true faithful, because it's kind of dreary out and the Jaguars are playing again today. So you guys are truly the hangers on. Just wanted to welcome everybody back, and just a quick recap from last week. So last week, if you weren't here, and I apologize because something went wrong with the video last week, and so there's a great video, but there's no sound. So it's just like, so I'll send out my notes, the slides, but it was such a great discussion, and it was such a shame that it got there. You know, you can see it; it's amazing. But I really appreciate everybody's thoughts on that, and it's kind of where we left it. We were talking about Israelite origins, and we ended up with that the Israelites, most scholars agree, and this is kind of murky. And so when I say most scholars agree, we're talking about ranges of probabilities, right? I mean, likely, this is best evidence. My son and my son-in-law, my daughter's boyfriend, was, I think of him as my son-in-law because he's such a part of the family. We're waiting, yeah. It's like, come on, man, get with the program. They were talking about logic and probabilities. They're both in the financial markets and risk and all this stuff. And they were talking about Occam's razor, which is a philosophical principle, but it basically says if you have all the data, the simplest answer is the most likely. So, you know, conspiracy theories, complicated, it has to go this way. That's typically not the way things go. Things usually in nature follow the simplest path. But as we try to figure that out, we have to be convinced that we have all the data. And when it comes to the emergence of the Israelites, we for sure don't have all the data. We have maybe 20 pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to kind of piece together. But given what we do have, it seems to be that Israelites primarily were former Canaanites. They were the people who had lived in the land of Canaan, and during the late, and they were probably supplemented by Egyptians, immigrants, you know, but people who were probably on the lower end of society for the most part, who got just fed up with it, and they left for a better life up in the highlands of Israel, and kind of getting away from the more civilized sections where they had no real future.
So were they considered, say the Egyptians, were they considered immigrants?
Yeah, there may have been. There's a lot of history, documented history of Semitic people moving down into Egypt during times of famine. Egypt, the climate of Egypt is governed by the Nile River, so it's somewhat immune. If they were having a famine or arid times in Israel or Canaan, Egypt was a little more lush and had more food. So people would move and migrate back and forth. Good morning, good morning. They would migrate back and forth. So, you know, kind of groups of, you know, an eclectic group of people, but primarily Semitic in their origins. And what we talked about, archaeologists and sociologists have documented what's called the late Bronze Age collapse. And for whatever reason, and the reasons are somewhat unclear, it may have been some kind of climate, famine, an earthquake, or I don't know, something happened. We don't really know what. There's not a lot of records. But what we do see is evidence all throughout the ancient Near East and the ancient world of civilizations, long-standing civilizations that kind of just over a 200-year period from 1200 to 1000 just kind of fell into collapse. And that really happened, and so a lot of scholars think that coming out of that collapse, civilizations were collapsing, known government entities and powerful entities were collapsing. Egypt, which had controlled much of what is now Israel for hundreds and hundreds of years, all of a sudden pulled back into their kind of more traditional borders, leaving kind of an empty space, a power vacuum that allowed, people to kind of form a new community and a new alliance. So that's kind of the history of where the Israelites came from. Like I said, it's not perfectly clear, but it seems like people came from, the primary source of people were from their former Canaanites. They were already living in the land, but they were abandoning Canaanite city-states and moving up into the highlands to start kind of a new culture. And we can tell that from the pottery. There's pottery that has been found from early Israelite settlements that is very, very similar to Canaanite pottery found in Canaanite city-states. But the Canaanite pottery is much more decorative, much more fancy, formal, maybe used for more ritualistic purposes. And the Israelite pottery is much more basic. It's not as ornate. It's more utilitarian. So that's some of the linkages, an example of a linkage that kind of drives scholars to think, and sociologists, that the Israelites had roots in the Canaanite cities before kind of starting their own groups up in the highlands. But the question that kept coming up last week from David and Pam and others was, where did God come from? Where did Yahweh come from? And one of the things that Pam said last week that I thought was so insightful was that in their understanding of God, there's these different views of God, and she said, maybe it was the Israelites who were changing their views of God. And I think that's very much what we're going to see today, is that there were changing views of who God is and how God works that are right there in the Hebrew Bible. Most of what we have today that we're going to talk about today is in the Bible itself. So it's just kind of doing a close reading and cross-referencing.
Full disclosure, I probably heard that somewhere along the way.
No, it was very insightful. So Yahweh seems to be pretty omnipresent throughout the Bible, ubiquitous. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 2:4, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens. And it's like, oh yeah, God's been there from the very beginning, but things, as we've found in this class, sometimes are not always as simple as they seem. So we need to start in our journey, and we're going to start in the ancient city of Ugarit. Anybody ever heard of Ugarit? One couple people. Ugarit is a Canaanite city-state that sat just north of Israel, kind of right on the what now is the Israel-Syrian border. And it became a very, very prosperous city. It was a coastal city, so there was a port there and maritime. And here to the north was the Hittite Empire, and to the south was the Egyptian Empire. And they were right on the kind of the borderlands between the two. So they probably enjoyed a lot of trading with both of the empires, bringing things in and out. And it seemed to be a very affluent city. There's the archaeological evidence indicates that they had a lot of money, a lot of people coming in and out. And it's an old city. I mean, it was founded, the earliest evidence of settlement goes back to 7,000 BCE. So when they were excavating, they're finding stuff that's almost 10,000 years old here in Ugarit, which is amazing. But it really grew to importance in the late Bronze Age. That was when it really seemed to flourish. and they had there's all these lots of gilded statuettes and things that were recovered from there. And so from 3000 to 1200 BCE, kind of almost a 2,000-year period, that was a very, very influential city. But then we talk about the late Bronze Age collapse. Ugarit was one of the victims of that. Early on in 1185, there's a massive destruction of the city, and it never got re-inhabited. Nobody knows why it got destroyed. It could have been destroyed and come under attack from the sea people who kind of later became Philistines, we think, that we read about in the Bible. They were coming in and attacking and trying to find settlements along the coast. It could have been internal civil war or strife. There's not a lot of evidence other than we know it was pretty much completely destroyed around 1200. So in 1928, a young French archaeologist named Claude Frédéric Armand Schaeffer showed up leading a French expedition to excavate the city of Ugarit. And what they found a huge treasure trove. I can't remember what I put in the, no, I didn't put the picture in. There's in the city, in the ruins, the picture of the ruins, there was a entryway into like a huge chamber underground, and inside were thousands of clay tablets, all written upon in a Aramaic cuneiform, very, very similar writing to Hebrew. So it's very related to Hebrew. It's not Hebrew, but it's very, very similar.
You had to be well dressed to be in the archaeological.
And in 1928, yeah, in 1928,
Heaven forbid if the tie was crooked.
That's right. You did archaeology in a suit. That's right. So they found all these tablets, and there's a number of things that it provides. Sociology, context. That's how we know a lot about what these ancient city-states look like. But in this library, there was also, it gave us an in-depth look at what ancient Canaanite religion looked like. And just to be perfectly clear, they didn't find anything here that specifically addressed the Bible or biblical stories. It's its own kind. Everything in Ugarit they were just doing their own thing there. And all of this pretty much predates most of the stories in the Bible. But we now understand that Canaanite religion was very, very similar to all the other ancient religions. Egypt, Babylonia, later it comes up with Greek and Roman religion. And what that is they envisioned a pantheon of gods, a group of gods, a council of gods. They had multiple gods, polytheistic. There wasn't just our idea of monotheism, wasn't there. There's a whole bunch of gods, and all the different gods have different purposes. And they worked together in a sort of divine council, and so it's like having cabinet meetings of, when the president has a cabinet meeting, or corporations have board meetings, and they all get together and they report out and talk about what they need to do. And the head of this divine council was a god named El. And El was the chief god and the father of the gods, and he was perceived as an old man who lived up on a mountain, very wise, beards, but very benevolent, and he was the god who kind of was in charge of everything. So remember that, because we're going to get to that again here in a few minutes, and I think you'll find it very interesting. And here's just some pictures. This was a statuette found of El at Ugarit, stone with gold leaf overlay. This other statuette of El was found in a temple to El in Megiddo, which is one of the cities that gets mentioned it's in the very far north of Israel and gets mentioned in Joshua and Judges. In Joshua, the Israelites conquered Megiddo, but in Judges, Megiddo is in Canaanite hands, and they're doing their thing. And this is just a picture off the internet. So I needed a third picture and I couldn't find another one. So there you go. Probably in the British Museum. I don't really know. I don't know. The Louvre has a huge group of that. Yeah, that I got to see most of that this summer. We were there before the big break-in. Remember reading about the break-in where they stole the crown jewels? Yeah, I would say the Louvre British Museum is 80 to 90% chance it's in one of those two, and then the next one would be, especially since Ugarit was excavated by the French, it may be in the Louvre.
Could be in the Egyptian museum.
And it could be in the Egyptian museum too. I'll see if I can find out, but yeah, we're planning a class field trip to London to see all of these ancient artifacts. So, El's the head god of the Canaanite religion. And if you go through and you read your Bible, and this is where having a good study Bible really helps you, because there's things in translation that kind of get dropped out. When I said that, and I had the two verses from Genesis, there was the Lord, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That word is actually, the word in Hebrew is Yahweh. It's the word Yahweh. The second verse said, when the Lord God began to do it, the word in Hebrew is Elohim, which is also a generic name for God. I may have that backwards. I can't remember which one. But regardless, it's the generic name for God. And you see this El showing up all throughout the Old Testament. Well, particularly, it's in a lot of places in the Old Testament, but mainly in Genesis. It's mostly in Genesis. El Elyon is mentioned in Genesis 14, 18 to 22. El Shaddai is kind of translated as God Almighty. That's in Genesis 17, 28, and 35. And if you're my age and you remember listen to Christian music when back in the 80s, Amy Grant was a famous singer, and she had a huge song called El Shaddai. So that's the one that I know. It pops into my head. El Olam, El Roy, El Gabor. So there's all these names that get connected back to El, which is a Canaanite god. It's kind of interesting.
Isn't that the same as like the Arabic use of al?
Yes.
And
So
it's like a pronoun. It's the. Yeah.
right. So in the Canaanite religion, El was the name, the personal name of the god. In Israelite religion, it seems that El is much more of a generic term for God. And then you have all of the suffixes that expand upon that, describe what kind of God, what God is. God, a mighty God, a serving God, an everlasting God. And we also see El showing up throughout the Hebrew Bible in various names. And so when you read the names of people in the Bible, Israel is the name of the nation, means strives with God, rules with God. Jacob was named, if you remember the story from Genesis, Jacob camps out by the river, and a stranger comes, and all night long he has to wrestle and fight with the stranger. And in the morning, he's like, they're still wrestling and fighting, and he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And then it turns out that he was wrestling with either an angel or with God, and they say, you shall be named from now on Israel, because you have striven with God, you have wrestled with God. So the name of the country, of the nation, really basically means wrestling with God. Bethel, that's a place where one of the King Jeroboam put together in the northern kingdom one of their worship sites. That means the house of El, the house of God. Samuel, Gabriel, Michael, Daniel, all of these names that come in the Bible all refer back to God. God is in their names, is kind of a root in their names. So there's certainly a strong connection, it seems to me, a pretty strong connection that there's some tradition that ties back to that Canaanite religion. There's a few other Canaanite deities, just to mention. Asherah is really important. She is the wife or the consort of El. So she's like the queen mother of the Canaanite pantheon. Baal is, remember, everybody knows Baal because there are all the stories in the Bible. Everybody's fighting against Baal. Most famously, Ezekiel, who goes and, not Ezekiel, Elijah is battling the Baal worshipers, and they have the big contest, and he's like, build an altar, put your animals on the altar, call your gods, and have them set fire to the sacrifice, and so the Baal priests do all their things trying to call Baal, who's a storm god and a warrior god, to come down and consume their sacrifice, and Baal never shows up, and Elijah starts giving him a hard time. He's like, oh, maybe he's asleep, maybe he's in the bathroom, and he can't hear you. And then when it comes to Elijah's turn, he pours a liquid all over, presumably water, all over his sacrifice, calls on the name of God, big giant lightning bolt, everything gets consumed, and then the Israelites go and they massacre all the Baal priests. So, pretty typical Old Testament story. A nice statement of faith and followed by massive bloodshed. But Baal was a warrior god and a storm god who would lead them into battle when they had to go to war. So let's talk for a moment about Asherah. Asherah is was a fertility goddess in the Canaanite pantheon. She was, because she was a fertility, she was connected to nature, and it appears that both in Ugaritic texts and in the Hebrew Bible, when they mention Asherah, that she was viewed as a tree or like a pole. They talk about sacred poles, like maybe like a maypole or something like that. We're not really sure. There's not a lot of archaeological remains of Asherah because most of what they would use would be wood, which decays and disappears, as opposed to other gods who are stone. But we do have some stone depictions of Asherah and some small figurines that have been found. But she was very, very popular. She was the one who could go and intercede for you on behalf to El. So if you had an issue, or if your village had an issue and you needed to get to El so that to let him know that there was a problem that needed to be fixing, you could talk to Asherah, and she would go talk to El and be able to get things resolved for you. And so you see this all the time. The Bible rails against cutting down the sacred poles, cutting down the sacred trees. These are all kind of references to worship of Asherah within Israelite society. And then Baal was a storm god. His name shows up not only in Canaanite religion, but in some other religions across the ancient Near East. But he was primarily, he was a major figure in Canaanite religion. And his epithet was he who rides on the clouds. So he would come in. So thunder, lightning, fire, clouds, all of that's all part of being a storm god. The storm gods bring rain, but always with a lot of thunder and lightning and, that kind of stuff. When we have big thunderstorms in the summer here, if we were all worshiping Canaanite, we would say, oh, Baal's riding in and bringing us some rain. So the rain is good, but it's always accompanied with a bunch of drama along the side. Oop, that's an extra slide. So we see in Canaanite religion this idea of a divine council. We see El, we see Asherah, Baal, storm gods. And now let's take a quick look at the Hebrew Bible. And I think what we can see is a lot of similarities that show up in the Old Testament. So if you read Psalm 82 as an example, the psalmist says, God has taken his place within the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and to the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So the psalmist is like saying, God is in place with all the divine council and all the other gods, and this is humanity's prayer to them or petition to them is take care of the wicked, quit blessing the wicked people, take care of us, raise us up and the lonely and the destitute. Oop, uh-oh. And then at the end of the psalm, they say, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in the darkness, and all the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are the gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, but clearly that we could go into deep theological discussion about what this means. But clearly the psalmist is talking to this council of gods. First, he's like, listen, you all have the power to fix this, but you're not doing it. You need to help us out here. In Job, you remember the story of Job? Job is the good guy living on earth, and then all these bad things happen to him. Job starts out with this phrase, these verses, one day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, before Yahweh, before Elohim. And the Satan, this is the root of Satan, but at this point in Canaanite mythology or in Israelite theology, he wasn't really evil. He was just part of the divine council, and he's kind of like the contrarian of the group. And a lot of companies, Dave and I have talked about this before, a lot of companies will have, the CEO will say to a couple of people before a big board meeting, listen, I need somebody to be the contrarian and argue against what, we're going to have this big merger. I need to hear all the possibilities of what could go wrong. And so somebody comes in and it's just like, they're part of the team, but their job is to say, things aren't always as great as you seem to think they are. Here's all the things that could happen that could go wrong. And that seems to be what the Satan, his role is here. He's also called the accuser, is the translation that was in the NRSV. So he shows up and he's there with the rest of the sons of God before the Lord. And the Lord said to him, where have you come from? And the Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking up and down upon it. And God says to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. So here's this divine council interaction. And then if we kept reading, there's a lot to Job. It's a long book. But the Satan says, well, yeah, he only follows you because he's wealthy and he's had all these good things and you've blessed him. And he goes, you take all that away and it'll be a different story. And so then comes the progression of the rest of the book where Job loses all his wealth, all his family dies, except for his wife. And his wife is like, you need to curse God because God has given you all these terrible things. And Job's like, no, I'm not going to do it. And then his friends come. And they're like, you need to get rid of this God of yours because he's doing all these terrible things to you. And Job's like, nope, I'm not going to do it. So it's become, in kind of theological terms, this thing of God hasn't deserted you, hasn't always deserted you, even though things are bad, kind of the message. But the key for us is all of this starts out with a meeting of the divine council here in the Hebrew Bible. So it seems to be that that this tradition of El is kind of a holdover from Canaanite religion. So as the Israelites are in the highlands and kind of forming into a new identity, they've taken with them a lot of their traditions, and they've taken with them this tradition of El and the high God. And they've also continued to worship Asherah. They continue to kind of worship Baal. If you read 1st and 2nd Kings, all through 1st and 2nd Kings is just long diatribes against the people in Israel who are worshiping. They're not worshiping Yahweh. They're not doing. They're worshiping Asherah. They're having idols. They're having all these other things. But the point of the text is, why would you write a text condemning worship of other deities if people weren't doing it? If everybody was just worshiping Yahweh the way they were supposed to, we wouldn't have those texts. So that seems to be that within the Israelite religion, they're hanging on to kind of their Canaanite roots. And so I've termed this the God of the North. There's kind of this idea of a northern God, and I'm not saying of the northern kingdom per se, but kind of out of the Canaanite states. Most of the ancient Canaan was the northern kingdom rolling up into Syria, and they kind of are hanging on to this idea of El. They're reinterpreting it, as Pam said. They're kind of growing and developing, but there's definitely some similarities that are hanging on to there. But what we haven't talked about, though, in all of this discussion, is Yahweh, right? Yahweh is how we know God. And Yahweh does not appear in any Canaanite texts. It doesn't appear in any ancient Egyptian texts. It seems to be a very much an idea that grew within Israel and with this Hebrew group. Mostly. Most scholars would say it originated outside of the Canaanite religious system, and it looks like it came from the nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes living in the desert region around Judah, particularly Sinai and Midian. So where is Sinai and Midian? So before, Ugarit was way up here, right? Now we're down here looking at the Sinai Peninsula down here, and this little stretch of land right here on the other side of this little branch of the Red Sea is the land called Midian. And if you remember in Exodus, Moses, the story in Exodus is Moses kills the Egyptian. He has to flee Egypt. So he flees Egypt, and where does he go? He goes to Midian. And there he meets his soon-to-be father-in-law, who's a priest of Midian. It's like, oh, that's kind of interesting. A priest of Midian. So they've got their gods here, different from the Egyptian gods. And then when Moses is here, he has this encounter on Mount Sinai. So we talked a little bit about this. Sometimes it's called Mount Sinai. Sometimes it's called Mount Horeb. It seems to be somewhere kind of close to Midian. So if we go back to the map, you know, we're in this part of the country. Nobody knows exactly where all this is. Mount Sinai, if you go to the Middle East today and go to visit Mount Sinai, you end up on a little church way down here at the tip of the Sinai Peninsula that has been called, this is Mount Sinai. But when you read through the stories and there's no reason for, even if you're taking the Exodus stories as literal, that they would go way down here to go to Mount Sinai. Or why Moses, if he's living in Midian with his father-in-law and his family, would go way down here to raise a sheep or whatever. So most scholars say Sinai, Horeb, whatever you want to call it, is somewhere in this area. And there's this mountain range that have these unique geologic features with the mountain and then this black ore up at the top of the mountain that hasn't been eroded away. And it gives the impression that the top of the mountain has been burned. You know, it looks like it's been burned off or ashen. It's just a geologic coincidence. But you read in the Exodus the stories when the children of Israel get to Mount Sinai, there's clouds, there's thunder, there's lightning, there's fire, all up at the top of the mountain, because that's where God lives. Yahweh lives at the top of the mountain. Does that sound familiar to the Canaanite stories? Moses' father-in-law is a priest of Midian. Yahweh comes and talks to Moses through the burning bush, again, fire. He leads Moses, they lead the people through their traveling in the wilderness with a pillar of fire. You keep getting these images over and over again of fire, thunder, kind of a storm god sounding. So Yahweh sounds a lot like a Baal, a storm god. In Judges 5, there's a verse that says, Yahweh has marched from Seir, which is another word for Midian. So Yahweh is marching up from the south into Canaan to deliver the children of Israel. Deuteronomy says, Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. So there's definitely this other tradition, a separate tradition of Yahweh coming from the south, a southern God. Like I said before, the texts depict Yahweh as a storm god, very similar to a storm god. Yahweh leads Israel into battle. Yahweh gets manifested with fire, lightning, earthquakes, smoke. He resides on mountaintops. And so a lot of scholars have kind of come to the conclusion that this Yahweh tradition comes from immigrants who are coming from the south, maybe escaped slaves, Semitic people leaving Egypt and working their way up from the south up into the north, but somewhere along the line eventually entered into the El pantheon before ultimately merging and becoming the same as El. So you've got this northern tradition, a southern tradition that seem to have somewhat merged together into this conception of Yahweh. There's a couple of statements that I think are a couple of verses, and so this part is a little thin. So if you just proof and top, but I think what it does is it shows that this is a reasonable, plausible idea. That there are little verses or segments in the Bible where old texts get incorporated. So we've talked about how the text of the Hebrew Bible got compiled, edited together, re-edited, reinterpreted over the centuries. But you can see little passages here and there. So you see one of the oldest passages in the Bible is the Song of the Sea, where the Egyptians get wiped out as they're chasing the Israelites out of Egypt, get wiped out and drowned in the Red Sea. That's one of the oldest passages. Another one of the very old passages is the Song of Deborah that recounts Deborah's and Barak's triumph over an army invading Israel. Another one is the third one of the, if you had them in the top three, is what's called the Song of Moses. And this is the last part of Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is kind of collecting all this. And so Moses has, when we look at the Pentateuch, there's all the origin stories in Genesis. There's the Exodus in Exodus, wandering around in the desert at the end of Exodus and in Numbers. Leviticus is stuck in the middle with all these detailed instructions on how to build the tabernacle. And then you get to Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy restates what the law is. And then at the end of that, most of that, around chapter 30 or so, it goes into this Moses giving a speech to the Israelites where he recounts all the things that Yahweh has done for the Israelites. So this is in that speech, and scholars think that that speech is a text, a holdover text from very, very early in the Israelite tradition. And the text says, when the Most High, this is Deuteronomy 32:89, when the Most High, and the Hebrew word in the text is Elyon, so that El God, when the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. And the Lord's, Yahweh's, the word Lord is Yahweh, the Lord's portion was his people, Jacob was his allotted share. So what this is saying is divine counsel. All the gods are there. And all the gods say, hey, we got this earth and we got all these people. We need to divide up who's in charge of what. We can't all be in charge of everything. And so El says, great idea. What we'll do, we've got however many gods, 100 gods. There's 100 of you guys. So we'll divide the earth up into 100 portions, and each of you will have your own group. So Baal, you get this portion, and Asherah, you get this portion, and these gods get this portion, and Yahweh, you get Jacob. You get the tribes of Jacob. That's your portion of the world. So even within the Hebrew Bible, there seems to be some old remnants that Yahweh was not necessarily the top god. Yahweh was one of the other gods, kind of a storm god similar to Baal. That eventually, as their society developed and as their conception and understanding of God developed, Yahweh moved up into the El position and became synonymous with El, before eventually, by the late Kings period and the exile and the post-exile, by the time of Jesus, all of this El stuff was pretty much gone. Yahweh was the main God. So it seems like there's a little bit of discussion or a little bit of development as to who God is. So they seem to have started out with kind of a polytheistic state. Like I said, a Canaanite god from the north, a storm god in the south. Eventually these merged together. In Exodus, when God's talking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he says, and Moses is like, I got to tell him who you want me to go to Egypt and free the people, but I got to tell them who sent me. They're not going to just believe me. And he says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. So what scholars are saying here is this is one of the passages where they're starting to weave together this tradition. The old tradition was El Shaddai was a different God, Yahweh was a different God, El was a different God, and now we're starting to move all of that together and sum it up into one God. But even though that was occurring theologically, I think the worship of other gods, this polytheistic worship, was going on throughout Israel and throughout Canaan. And we see that in all the stories. We see it in the stories in Kings, in Samuel and Kings. We see it even in the story of Rachel when she runs away from she and Jacob leave Laban, right, to go back to the land of Canaan, and she steals all of Laban's household gods. And Laban's like, "Where's the gods?" And she's sitting on the big cushion, and she's like, "Yeah, I'd get up and give you a hug, Dad, but I'm kind of in the way of women right now." And he's like, "Yeah, don't get up." And she's got all Laban's gods under her skirts. There's stories. I had it in my head just a second ago, and now I lost it. Well, if I think of it, I'll tell you. Oh, there's stories in the Old Testament where this rich guy sets up. I think this is in Judges. It's either in Judges or maybe in 1 Samuel. Anyway, he's a wealthy man, and God has blessed him, and so in gratitude, he sets up a shrine in his house, and he gets gods, idols, in that family shrine, and then he hires this guy to come be a priest for him, to kind of run the shrine so that they can and run and kind of make sure everything's going the way it should be. So even though he's a devout follower of Yahweh, it never says, that he's not a Yahweh follower, but they kind of have this side hustle going on where they're always got, cover down all your bets and hedge and make sure that just in case. We see like when the northern kingdom broke away from the southern kingdom, Jeroboam sets up shrines to Yahweh that feature a lot of aspects of the original Canaanite religion. Bethel and Dan, golden calves, altars. The Judean writers talk about, they kind of go against aspects of Canaanite worship. So this gets a little bit in the weeds, but this is a passage from Exodus where God's telling Moses, "Make for me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your offerings of well-being." But if you make it, so earth, dirt, just mound up the dirt and create an altar. "But if you make for me an altar of stone, do not build it with hewn stones or cut stones, because if you use a chisel upon it, you profane it, and you shall not go up on steps to the altar, so that your nakedness," if you're on the steps and you look down, look up, the priest didn't have anything under his robes, will become exposed by it. Why does God care about hewn, chiseled stones and steps? That was a key element of Canaanite worship. All of their altars were cut stones, all the ones that we found. There were a number of them in Ugarit, and we found other ones other places. And they have steps leading up to it, and then the altar itself was all nicely chiseled and made to look really pretty. And here's Yahweh saying, I don't want anything to do with that. Keep it at ground level, just make it out of the dirt. Kind of reflects a very, more utilitarian mindset from where Israel may have come from. Don't do it like the Canaanites did it. They didn't do it right. This is the way you do it right. And then of course in Exodus, take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you're going. You shall tear down their altars, break down their pillars, cut down their sacred poles. That's the term back to Asherah. And you shall worship no other God, because the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. But despite this, the Israelites seem to kind of keep, they had what scholars call this mindset of one God for the people of Israel. You notice nowhere if you read in the Old Testament, you never read where they say these other gods don't exist. Like even Elijah, when he's doing the thing with Baal, the big showdown with Baal, he never says Baal doesn't exist. That's crazy. You guys don't know what you're talking about. There's no other gods except Yahweh. he acknowledges there's Baal. What he's saying is, here in the land of Israel, Yahweh is more powerful. Baal has no place here. So what that's called is monolatry, where these people accept the fact that there's other gods in the world, but their God is only Yahweh. They have one God for their people. Other people have their gods. The Egyptians have their gods. Let the Egyptians have their gods. We have Yahweh. Let the Babylonians have their gods. They have their gods. The Egyptians have their gods. We have Yahweh. That's the kind of concept that they have. So they're not. It's not monotheism. It's still polytheism because they're believing and accepting the existence of other gods. They're just saying in Israel, we only worship one God. But most polytheists, what we have from all around the other nations and other things that we've found is that they just kind of adopted other gods. There was no problem in adding another god in. And so, if you were a worshiper of the Greek gods and you worshiped Zeus and Aphrodite, and then you came to this little town in Israel and they had a god named Yahweh, sure, add Yahweh in, no big deal. Again, hedge your bets, cover your bases. And they're the regional gods, right? So you're in their region, so you need to make some sacrifices to them. That doesn't change the fact that you still believe in Zeus or whatever. You're just being respectful of the local god as you're traveling through their country. And it seems to me that that's what the Israelites were doing all through the Old Testament. They would live a little bit in the polytheism versus monotheist world. They would kind of straddle that line. They knew they were only supposed to be worshiping Yahweh, but they would cover down and make sure they had enough respect for the other gods. This was kind of a theory until the late 70s when they found an inscription at Knilet Ajud. And I think I mentioned this one before. This is like the Buc-ee's of the ancient world. So it's a little village, a little outpost or a way station. On your way down from Judah into Egypt, you would go through Knilet Ajud, and you could stop there, you could get some food, you could get some water, because you're kind of traveling right along the edge of the Sahara Desert. Maybe an oasis, yeah. So it was a little stop of civilization, and then the next leg of your journey, a day or two or three into Egypt, was going to be in a kind of a dry time, so you stock up, and then and there in an inscription they found there was this statement: "May Yahweh in his Asherah grant everything that Israel asks. May Yahweh grant everything Israel needs." So the Israelites were or somebody, I don't know if it was an Israelite, but somebody was certainly conflating Yahweh with Asherah during that time. So I think what this really gets down to is this, just like the idea of Israel coming from kind of a melting pot type of formation, is what the archaeology seems to suggest. The whole idea of Yahweh and of God seems to have been a bit of a melting pot too. And I think what it is like what Pam said last week, it's humans growing and developing and changing their understanding of who God is. I view this as an entire search, not that this is the God from the very beginning and everybody's just dense and they can't see it. The Bible is a record of this development of understanding of who God is. Where did God come from? How powerful is God? And from this comes these ideas that we talked about last year of an omniscient God, an all-powerful God, a God who knows everything. The things that we would think of today as descriptors of God had their roots in here, as Yahweh kind of was, at least in the minds of the Israelites, working his way up the chain, and they kind of like, wait a minute, Yahweh is really powerful. Yahweh is not just an average God. I think Yahweh is the chief God. Wait a minute, I don't think there are these other gods. I think it's just Yahweh is our God, you know. It's a development of an idea. I told Terry last night, I said, I'm really excited. I hope I didn't bore you guys to death because I find this fascinating. Cora.
Are the Palestinians, were they the Canaanites who decided not to become Israelites?
That's a really hard question because I think so many years, and I don't know the origins of the modern day Palestinians, and
Or just the ancient,
I think there were, I think in the ancient times there were Canaanites who kind of were living in, because even when Israel became the majority ruler of Israel, so in the times of the kings, you had Solomon and you had the other kings, they still had Canaanite cities, and they didn't have complete control of all the borders, and there were little pockets. Jerusalem, until the time of David, was inhabited and ruled by the Jebusites. They're not Canaanites, they're kind of somebody different, but there's these little pockets of different people. So you got to remember that in these ancient times, it was more like medieval times where you had these little city-states and little individual kings, and then maybe a high king who kind of sat over all these little individual kings. It's not necessarily our modern conception of a country that has this firm, the United States or France or whoever, or Russia even. I mean, it doesn't have to be a democracy. You could have a more autocratic country, but it's like, this is all our land, and this one we have one strong control. It would be like if you had the United States. It was like the United States before the United States, right? It was like 13 colonies, so we were all kind of here. And when we first became the United States, it was the Articles of Confederation, and it was this very loose, because they were kind of like, we don't want a strong federal government. We want everybody to do their own thing, and we in Massachusetts don't want to do what they're doing down in Virginia. We want to do our own thing. And Pennsylvania that's all those Quakers, they can do their own thing. And so it was this loose, it was kind of more like that. So I don't think of Israel, when we talk about ancient Israel, as a super solid, they had kingdoms and they had kings and they were kind of bound together, but I don't think of it as like in modern times. I think of it as there's still little pockets of other people. Judah ruled itself, but down on the coast in Judah were the Philistines, and there were constant border clashes moving back and forth between, even though the Israelites said, that's part of our land, the Philistines were like, well, we live here now, so it's our land. And then you had the Egyptians coming in. So you always had, that was the interesting thing about Israel, is everybody's going through it. Right. If you're from the north and you're getting to Egypt, you got to go through Israel. If you're coming from Egypt, similar to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a crossroads where, for the trade routes, historically, everybody had to go through there. Nobody really wanted to be there, but they had to go through there. So it became really strategic to be able to control that, which is when we, during the Afghanistan war, you could think back, the historians would come on TV and like, people have been fighting to control Afghanistan for hundreds of years, thousands of years, because it's this key crossroads. Yeah, and I think Israel used to be a very, with the advent of modern ships and airplanes, and it's not as critical anymore, to be able to go through. But
shipping is still, it is the cheapest way of taking cargo, large amounts of cargo to a place. Right.
But easier to avoid if you're bringing ships in, you can just, when you're in the Mediterranean, spear off, as opposed to if you were transporting goods through overland or armies overland, you had to go through Israel.
What's interesting to me is how small the area was then and
Yes.
it is still today. I mean,
Yes.
we live in North America, you know,
Right.
2,000 or 3,000 miles, so are you next door, are you?
Mm-hmm.
Up there, it's 35 miles and
Yeah.
it's a whole different thing.
Yeah. You're in a very small and compressed space, for sure. Anybody else? Any other questions? And again, please, I hope this is something that will help make you think and contemplate.
How big would some of these settlements be? You've talked about various settlements. Do we have any idea of how many
Yeah.
size the population would be?
Some of these big city states were maybe 5,000 people, 10,000 people. When you go to the city, the walled city was very small, and then there was all the farmland. So they all kind of followed the same model that we see if you go to Europe and travel around. They'd find a strategic place up on a hill, they'd build the fortified city because they had a good defensive position. There was water nearby, there was fertile land in the valley, and then all the workers would live down here. But then when the marauders would come in to attack, everybody would come up into the city and they'd wall up the city. So, I'd say probably most of these are 5,000-10,000
Still, that
people.
must have been big in those times.
Oh yeah, in ancient times. I mean, compared to like a village of 35 or 40 people,
Right.
it's huge.
And were they mostly herders?
I think there were differences. So up in the highlands, you had a lot more hills and stuff that makes agriculture more challenging. So you had a lot more goat herding, sheep herding, that kind of stuff. But when you got down on the coastal plain, it's very fertile, and so there was a lot of agriculture and farming down in there.
When did the Palestinians appear? Palestinians.
Oh man, so that's a really tough question.
Trying to get to.
Gaza has been around all the way back to what we're talking about.
Yeah,
The city of Gaza.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's changed hands so many times, and people have moved back and forth. I mean, I think it's been inhabited. The Israelites, the ancient Israelites, controlled it. The Romans controlled it, and then it moved into more in the Middle Ages. Control. It was part of the Byzantine Empire for a long time, and people, it just kind of back and forth. I don't.
The Ottomans controlled it, and then the
Yeah.
Ottomans were destroyed, and the British controlled the territory, and that's where we are in modern day. We're still playing that one out.
So I think Israel, and the other thing too is it's hard because so many people move around. Like in the modern state of Israel, the Jewish people, they were in the diaspora, and then and there were Jews who lived there in Israel when it was not its own nation, and then after World War II, a lot of people moved in. So I don't have a good answer for you. It's outside of my area of expertise.
The Palestinians were still there whenever the diaspora came back. There were still people.
There have been
living
people living there. When the Israelites left, it didn't just go away. I mean, people moved in, which is why on the site of where the temple stood is now the mosque. And it's just a sign of changing control of, another group kind of took control and now they're in charge and claim it as their own. So it's really hard. It's not as cut and dried as people on TV sometimes want to make you believe.
I was really surprised to read the other day that the amount of people in 1947 that were displaced, which is the big defining moment, were under 1,000 people on either side.
Yeah.
That really,
Yeah.
really, I always thought it was a lot more people that were pushed out. It was less than 1,000 people were actually displaced.
Right.
And that's what they're still fighting
They
about.
were Muslim
In Jordan and
and
Egypt
Christians
wouldn't
that were
accept
pushed out.
The people in Jordan and Egypt wouldn't, they closed their borders and wouldn't let those 600 people as well as weren't allowed to migrate.
I didn't realize it was so few. I have
I didn't either. I
a
thought
friend
it was
whose
a lot more.
grandparents had to leave and they were Christian.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been great. You guys have a great week. We're going to start next week and we're going to talk about David. So that'll take us for a few weeks because there's a lot to talk about David. So that'll be exciting.
He was an interesting guy.
Yeah, he was. Have a great week. Good to see you.